Hello, and welcome again to the channel. I am joined by my co-host, Pat. Remember to hit that subscribe button. In this presentation, we will talk about the advent and impact of indentured labor in Jamaica and the Caribbean, and how it shaped us. The abolition of chattel slavery across the British Empire, formally enacted in 1834 and fully realized with the end of the apprenticeship system in 1838, marked a profound rupture in the socio-economic fabric of the Caribbean. It did not, however, signal the end of exploitative labor practices. Instead, it ushered in a new era characterized by the mass importation of indentured laborers, primarily from Asia, but also from Africa and Europe, to sustain the plantation economies that slavery had built. This system of indentured servitude, often described by contemporaries and later historians as a new system of slavery, or semi-slavery, became a defining feature of the post-emancipation Caribbean landscape between roughly 1838 and 1920. It represented a complex and often brutal transition, fundamentally reshaping the region's demographic composition, economic trajectory, and cultural identities. While legally distinct from slavery, indenture involved contracts that bound workers to specific employers and locations for extended periods, often under harsh conditions enforced by penal sanctions. This report examines the historical context, origins, recruitment processes, working and living conditions, socio-cultural experiences, economic and demographic impacts, eventual abolition, and enduring legacy of indentured labor, with a particular focus on Jamaica within the broader Caribbean context. The system drew upon a diverse pool of laborers, including substantial numbers from India and China, alongside Africans, including those liberated from slave ships, and various European groups, each bringing their own histories and experiences into the crucible of the Caribbean plantation world. Understanding indenture is crucial not only for comprehending Caribbean history, but also for recognizing how colonial power structures adapted and persisted beyond the formal abolition of slavery.
Thanks, Peter. The period immediately following full emancipation in 1838 was one of significant upheaval for the British Caribbean plantocracy. Planters across the region, particularly in colonies like Jamaica, Trinidad, and British Guiana, raised alarms about a crippling labor shortage that threatened the viability of the sugar industry, the cornerstone of colonial wealth. This perceived shortage, however, stemmed less from an absolute lack of potential workers and more from the unwillingness of formerly enslaved people to continue laboring on the estates under the conditions offered. Having endured the brutalities of slavery and the subsequent, often abusive apprenticeship system, 1834-1838, the newly freed population sought genuine autonomy and fair compensation for their labor. Planters, however, largely refused to meet these demands, attempting to maintain pre-emancipation modes of control, offering low wages and perpetuating harsh working conditions. They made little effort to improve plantation infrastructure or provide adequate amenities, expecting freed people to work much as they had under slavery. Consequently, a significant exodus from the plantations occurred wherever alternatives existed. In colonies with available land, such as Jamaica and Trinidad, many former slaves established themselves as independent peasants, cultivating provision grounds, engaging in small-scale farming for local markets, and forming free villages outside the planters' direct control. This pursuit of economic independence and escape from the physical and psychological confines of the plantation was a rational response to the continued attempts at exploitation. The planters, steeped in the ideology of slavery, often interpreted this withdrawal not as a demand for justice, but as inherent laziness or unwillingness to work, reinforcing their desire for a labor force they could more easily command. The situation differed in densely populated islands like Barbados, where limited land availability restricted the options for ex-slaves, keeping more of them tied to wage labor on the estates, thus lessening the immediate planter demand for imported labor on the scale seen elsewhere. The failure of the apprenticeship system to smoothly transition to free labor further convinced planters and colonial authorities that a new source of cheap, reliable, and controllable labor was essential to prevent the collapse of the sugar economy. Indenture, therefore, emerged not merely as a solution to a labor deficit, but as a mechanism to reassert control and maintain the profitability of the plantation system in the face of black freedom.
Between 1838 and 1917, global migration to the Caribbean was driven by the demand for labor following emancipation. Over 500,000 Indians, mainly from Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Madras, migrated under British colonial pressures such as poverty, famines, landlessness, and the aftermath of the 1857 mutiny. Similarly, about 250,000 Chinese, mostly from Guangdong and Fujian, left due to political instability, overpopulation, natural disasters, and poverty. African laborers were brought through systems like reshaping in the French Caribbean or via British naval seizures of illegal slave ships. These so-called liberated Africans were often re-indentured instead of repatriated. Europeans also contributed to the labor pool, including Irish, Scots, and Portuguese, many of whom were political prisoners or impoverished peasants lured by land or work opportunities. These migrations reflected the expanding global capitalist and imperialist systems that simultaneously created both the need for cheap labor and the dire conditions that compelled people to migrate. The indentured labor system in the Caribbean was riddled with exploitation from recruitment to contract enforcement. Early abuses in the 1838 Indian migration to British Guiana prompted state control, but unethical practices persisted. Recruiters in India and China used deception, coercion, and even kidnapping to enlist migrants, often exploiting their ignorance and desperation. Oversight bodies like India's Protector of Emigrants had limited impact due to collusion or weak enforcement. Contracts overwhelmingly favored employers, low wages, harsh penalties, and poor living conditions were the norm. Indian laborers were promised return passage after 10 years, but this was sometimes substituted with land. Breaches of contract were criminalized, enabling control through penal sanctions. The voyage itself was brutal, with overcrowding, disease, and high mortality rates. Despite later reforms, enforcement was lax. Though not legally enslaved, indentured laborers experienced severe coercion, confinement, and hardship, with the colonial state's involvement serving to systematize rather than reduce their exploitation.
Upon arrival in the Caribbean, indentured laborers, primarily Indians, were forced into grueling plantation work, particularly in the sugar industry. Their tasks spanned from clearing land to harvesting and factory processing, with some also employed in cocoa, coffee, cotton cultivation, and railway construction. Workdays often exceeded 12 hours, especially during the harvest. Labor was backbreaking, hoeing, weeding, manuring, and working in dangerously hot boiling houses, where accidents were common and sometimes led to amputations. Wages were low and unstable, often docked for minor infractions under the task work system. Absences triggered the double cut penalty, and non-payment of wages was frequent. A strict labor hierarchy enforced discipline, with sirdars policing fellow workers. Penal contract clauses criminalized minor offenses, allowing imprisonment and extensions to indenture terms. Planters held near absolute authority, and magistrates often sided with them in disputes. Living conditions were abysmal. Laborers lived in crumbling, overcrowded barracks, often the same as during slavery, with no privacy, poor ventilation, and dirt floors. Sanitation was grossly inadequate, with open defecation and unsafe water sources leading to diseases like cholera, malaria, and typhoid. Estate hospitals were few, poorly maintained, and lacked medicines. Infant mortality was high, and mandated housing and healthcare standards were largely ignored. Despite legal freedom, the reality of indenture was one of coercion, exploitation, and neglect. Many likened it to slavery, with some arguing it was even more oppressive due to the constant pressure of contracts and lack of any vested interest in the well-being of workers. The system prioritized planter profit at the expense of human dignity, health, and autonomy, leaving a lasting legacy of hardship for those who endured it. Despite harsh conditions, indentured laborers in the Caribbean actively resisted dehumanization by building community, preserving culture, and asserting their agency. Gender imbalances, especially among Indians and Chinese, led to social tensions, disrupted traditional family structures, and sometimes resulted in interracial unions. Traditional hierarchies, like the Indian caste system, weakened due to shared labor, cramped living conditions, and communal eating. Cultural resilience was central to their identity. Laborers maintained religious practices, built places of worship, and celebrated festivals such as Diwali and Hosei. Languages like Bhojpuri, Tamil, and Chinese dialects persisted, especially in rituals and music. Food, plants, and culinary styles introduced by migrants reshaped Caribbean diets. Music, dance, and performance, like Tassa drumming and Ram Lila, helped preserve cultural ties. Community bonds, often forged during the sea voyage, supported survival and adaptation. Many laborers established free villages post-contract, joined ethnic associations, and transitioned into small business ownership, gaining autonomy and economic foothold despite systemic marginalization.
The Indian indenture system, the longest running of its kind, was formally abolished in 1917, with the final contracts ending around 1920. This marked the collapse of a system long criticized as exploitative and inhumane. A key driver of its abolition was the rise of Indian nationalism. Influential figures like Mohandas K. Gandhi, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Madan Mohan Malviya, and Anglican priest C.F. Andrews condemned indenture as a new system of slavery. Andrews' investigations and reports, particularly on Fiji, exposed the moral and physical abuses faced by Indian laborers, galvanizing public opinion in India and pressuring both the colonial and imperial governments. Earlier investigations, such as the Dickens Committee in India and the 1870 Royal Commission in British Guiana, had already revealed systemic abuses. World War I further undermined the system by complicating global labor logistics and shifting imperial focus. With mounting political resistance, moral outrage, and logistical impracticalities, the British Empire was forced to end the system, marking a significant victory for transnational activism and anti-colonial resistance. Indentured labor left a lasting and complex legacy across Jamaica and the wider Caribbean. Demographically, it introduced substantial Indian and Chinese populations who are now vital to national identity. These migrations helped shape the region's hallmark diversity, giving rise to vibrant multi-ethnic societies. Culturally, indentured communities contributed languages, religions, Hinduism, Islam, Chinese traditions, festivals, Diwali, Hosei, and Chinese New Year, music, tassa, chutney, foodways, and crops like rice and mangoes. This fusion of African, Asian, and European influences fostered unique forms of creolization, producing new hybrid cultural expressions. Social structures evolved as new ethnic groups entered existing racial and class hierarchies. While tensions existed, so did intermixture and adaptation. Economically, Chinese and Portuguese migrants dominated retail, while Indians remained active in agriculture and later professional fields. Though many indentured laborers hoped to return home, most settled permanently due to cost, land grants, family ties, and limited prospects in India. In Jamaica, Indians shaped agriculture and crafts, while Chinese migrants transitioned into retail, founding the iconic Chinese shops. Both communities enriched Jamaican culture and history, embodied in the national motto, "Out of many, one people." Archival records and UNESCO recognition preserve this essential chapter of Caribbean history,